When most people think about counter-extremism in the UK, they imagine a few dangerous individuals being watched closely by MI5 or the police. But that is not how the real system works. Because the real challenge is scale. The UK is not dealing with just one suspect or 10 suspects or even a few hundred. It is dealing with thousands of people who may hold extremist views, support violent ideologies, spread dangerous propaganda, or show signs that they could move from belief to action. And the terrifying part is this: only a tiny fraction of them can be watched intensely at any one time. So how does the UK track so many potential extremists at once? How do the security services decide who needs urgent attention, who stays on the radar, and who might be quietly escalating in the background? And how do they do that without placing a physical surveillance team on every single suspect? Because that would be impossible. In reality, the UK uses a layered system. A system built on intelligence gathering, data analysis, local reporting, digital monitoring, risk scoring, policing, and constant prioritization. It is not one giant list with one giant answer. It is a living network of agencies, databases, investigations, referrals, analysts, and legal powers. And the whole thing exists for one reason: to identify the small number of people most likely to become an actual threat before they act. So in this video, we are going to break down how the UK tracks thousands of potential extremists at once. We will look at who is involved, how names get flagged, how risks are assessed, why most people are not under 24-hour surveillance, and what makes this system so difficult to manage. Because the truth is not just that the UK watches extremists, it is that it has built an entire infrastructure to sort, prioritise, and monitor risk at scale. And that infrastructure says a lot about how modern national security really works. Let's begin. The first thing to understand is that the UK does not treat all potential extremists as equal. That sounds obvious, but it is the foundation of the entire system. There is a huge difference between someone who posts extreme content online, someone who repeats radical talking points in private, someone who tries to recruit others, and someone actively preparing an attack. Those are all very different levels of danger. And if the state treated them all exactly the same, the system would collapse almost immediately. There are simply too many people of concern. So instead, the UK works through triage, in other words, sorting. Who is high risk right now? Who is concerning but not urgent? Who needs to stay on a list? Who needs a closer review? Who may need intervention? And who currently does not justify scarce surveillance resources? That triage model is the only reason the system can function. Because contrary to popular belief, tracking someone does not always mean following them in vans, tapping phones, and watching every move. That kind of intensive surveillance is extremely resource-heavy. It takes trained officers, analysts, legal approvals, technical capability, and time. If you tried to do that for thousands of people at once, you would run out of people, money, and operational capacity very quickly. So the UK instead spreads monitoring across multiple levels. At the centre of this system is intelligence. Not just secret intelligence, but intelligence in the broad sense. That includes information from MI5, counter-terror policing, local police forces, prisons, border systems, schools, councils, online reporting, community referrals, and in some cases, international intelligence partners. Each source may provide only a fragment, a post, a meeting, a travel pattern, a previous arrest, a tip-off, a speech, a contact, a purchase, a change in behaviour. One fragment on its own may mean very little. But when fragments are combined, patterns begin to appear. And that is where the real tracking system starts to make sense. Because the UK is not usually trying to maintain equal attention on every individual. It is trying to detect movement toward violence, movement toward organisation, movement toward capability, movement toward intent. That is the real focus. Not simply who holds offensive views, but who appears to be shifting toward a point where those views could become dangerous. Now, who actually does this work? Many people assume MI5 does everything, but that is not true. MI5 plays a central role in protecting national security, including counter-terrorism and hostile threats. But it is only one part of a much wider system. Counter-terrorism policing is crucial. This is the policing network focused specifically on terrorism-related threats and investigations. Then you have regional counter-terror units, local police forces, intelligence analysts, government departments, and specialist programs designed to identify or intervene in radicalization risk. There is also the prevent side of the system, which is more controversial and more preventative in theory. That part is designed to spot people at risk of radicalization before they cross into violence. So when we talk about the UK tracking extremists, what we are really describing is a web, a distributed ecosystem. Some parts collect intelligence, some assess it, some investigate, some intervene, some prosecute, some monitor after release, and some simply keep records that may later become important. This matters because scale is only manageable if the work is distributed. No single agency can track thousands of potential extremists alone. The second big idea is that not everybody enters the system the same way. There is no single front door. Some names enter through direct intelligence, others through arrests, others through online activity, others through referrals from schools, universities, health professionals, local authorities, prisons, or community contacts. Some enter because of association with known extremist networks, others because they tried to travel to conflict zones, shared violent material, made threats, expressed admiration for past attackers, or showed signs of mobilizing others. In some cases, the concern is ideological, in others, behavioral, and that distinction is important because one of the hardest things for the UK system is separating extreme opinion from credible threat. A democratic country cannot simply classify every extreme belief as an operational danger. But security agencies also cannot ignore the fact that some attackers give warning signs long before violence happens. So the tracking system is constantly trying to answer a difficult question. Is this person merely expressing something extreme? Or are they progressing toward real-world harm? That is a very difficult judgment call. And when you are making it across thousands of individuals, the margin for error matters enormously. This is where assessment frameworks become essential. Once a person is on the radar, the system tries to build a fuller picture. What ideology are they linked to? Are they isolated or networked? Do they have a history of violence? Have they tried to acquire weapons? Have they contacted known extremists? Are they consuming violent propaganda obsessively? Are they encouraging others? Do they have personal instability that might accelerate action? Have they crossed previous legal boundaries? Are they escalating? In other words, the UK is not just looking at beliefs. It is looking at a combination of intent, capability, access, vulnerability, behaviour, and trajectory. Trajectory may be the most important word here, because national security is often less about what someone is today, and more about where they seem to be heading. Someone who is angry but static may be less urgent than someone who is quietly becoming more organised, more secretive, more committed, and more operational. That is why analysts are so important. Tracking at scale is not just about collecting data, it is about interpreting it. You can have a huge number of reports, logs, names, digital traces, and intelligence fragments. But unless someone can connect them into a coherent judgment, the system becomes noisy and ineffective. And noise is dangerous, because too much noise can hide the real threat. This is one of the deepest problems in modern counter-terrorism. The challenge is not always lack of information. Sometimes it is too much information, too many names, too many weak signals, too many possible risks. Too many people who look concerning in one context but less significant in another. So the UK has to rank attention. This is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Some individuals will become high-priority subjects. Those are the people judged most likely to present a near-term threat or those linked to active investigations. Others will remain subjects of interest at a lower level. Their data may still be retained. Their activity may still be reviewed if new intelligence appears, but they will not receive the same intensity of scrutiny. This is why people are often shocked to learn that someone involved in a later attack may previously have been known to authorities. To the public, that can sound like failure. And sometimes it is failure. But sometimes it reflects the brutal reality of prioritization. Being known is not the same as being watchable around the clock. A person may have triggered concern years earlier, then appeared lower risk, then re-escalated. Or they may have been one name among many, without enough evidence at the time to justify intensive monitoring. That does not make the risk disappear. But it explains why the system depends so heavily on constant reassessment. And reassessment is continuous. New arrest, new online post, new travel history, new prison intelligence, new associate, new referral, new digital evidence. Any of these can push someone higher up the concern ladder, and just as importantly, lack of new activity can lower priority too. The system is dynamic. Or at least, it tries to be. Now let's talk about the part most people imagine first: surveillance. This is where public understanding is often the most distorted. Most potential extremists are not being followed in person every day. That would be impossible. Physical surveillance is expensive and selective. It is used where the threat level justifies it and where the intelligence gain is worth the operational cost. Instead, the broader system relies on layered visibility: records, reporting, inter-agency alerts, case reviews, digital leads, pattern analysis, and intelligence refreshes. Think of it less like one spotlight and more like many dimmer signals across a wide network. Most people on the radar are not under maximum scrutiny. They are in a system that can surface them again when something changes. That is how scale becomes manageable. Not by treating everyone as an active operation, but by structuring attention so that urgent cases can rise rapidly. Another important part of this is local knowledge. National intelligence matters, but local context often matters just as much. A person may be known in a neighbourhood, known to a school, known to probation, known to prison staff, known to community workers, known to local police. One agency might only see a fragment, but multiple fragments combined can radically change the assessment. This is why information sharing is such a central feature of the UK approach. Not perfect information sharing, not frictionless, but enough to create a broader picture than any single institution could produce on its own. And this is also why failures sometimes happen when fragments are not joined up properly. If a case sits in silos, the overall risk can be underestimated. So in simple terms, the UK tracks large numbers of potential extremists, partly by building systems that make weak signals easier to combine. Not every signal becomes an investigation, but signals can accumulate, and accumulation matters. Now, there is another uncomfortable truth here. The UK is not only tracking organised networks. A major challenge in recent years has been the rise of individuals who radicalise in fragmented ways, sometimes online, sometimes through mixed ideologies, sometimes through personal grievance fused with extremist content. These are harder to track because they may not fit neatly into traditional group structures. A person connected to a known network can sometimes be easier to map. A person spiralling alone online can be much harder to interpret. They may consume propaganda, violent manifestos, conspiracy content, and extremist narratives without clearly belonging to one movement. That creates a major scaling problem, because the system increasingly has to detect not just membership, but behaviour patterns, not just affiliation, but acceleration. This is one reason online spaces matter so much. Digital platforms can expose investigators to rhetoric, symbols, communities, and behavioural clues that might indicate deeper risk. But digital material creates another problem too: volume. The internet generates an enormous amount of extremist-adjacent content, outrage, threat language, and ideological signalling. So again, the problem becomes triage. What is just noise? What is attention-seeking? What is fantasy? What is ideological theatre? And what is the small fraction that signals genuine movement toward violence? That distinction is incredibly difficult. And it is one reason why false positives and missed warnings can exist in the same system at the same time. The UK therefore relies not on one perfect detection method, but on layered judgment, human judgment, analytical judgment, operational judgment, legal judgment, and sometimes intervention before prosecution. This brings us to PREVENT. PREVENT is one of the most debated parts of the UK counter-extremism framework. Supporters argue that it allows concerns to be raised early, before violence happens. Critics argue that it can be overly broad, misapplied, or damaging to trust. Both sides of that debate matter. But regardless of where someone stands on it politically, Prevent shows something important about how the UK handles scale. It tries to expand the detection net earlier, not only at the point of criminal conspiracy or attack planning, but at the point where vulnerability, radicalisation, or behavioural warning signs appear. In other words, the system is not only designed to catch attackers, it is also designed to identify people who might become attackers or who might be pulled deeper into extremist ecosystems. That dramatically increases the number of people entering some part of the wider counter-extremism machinery. And that, again, makes prioritisation unavoidable. Now let's look at prisons and post-release monitoring. This is a major issue in the UK, because prisons can be places of containment, but also places of further radicalisation. Some extremist offenders may continue influencing others while inside. Others may leave prison still presenting a threat. So the tracking problem does not end with conviction. In some cases, release can create a new phase of risk assessment. How stable is the individual? Who are they reconnecting with? What restrictions apply? What behaviour is visible? Are they re-entering old networks? This means the UK's tracking model is not simply about spotting unknown people from scratch. It is also about managing people already known, sometimes over long periods, across different institutions and phases of life. And that long-term management is resource-intensive in a different way. Not always dramatic, but persistent, because the danger may not be immediate every day, but it may never be fully gone either. Another factor is borders and travel. Movement can reveal intent, contacts, or changing risk. Travel patterns have long been one part of counter-terror assessment, especially where conflict zones, suspicious routes, or known associates are involved. Again, not every unusual trip means danger, but in combination with other indicators, movement can matter. And this is the recurring theme of the whole system: combination. Very few cases are judged on one factor alone. It is the combination of indicators that shapes attention. Online activity plus known associates, travel plus propaganda consumption, prison history plus renewed contact, threat statements plus acquisition behaviour, association plus escalation. This combination logic is what allows a state to manage a very large field of possible concern. Because instead of reacting equally to every single input, it looks for clustering. Clustering of risk, clustering of behaviour, clustering of signals, and once clusters appear, priority can rise quickly. Now, none of this means the system is all-powerful. Far from it. In fact, one of the biggest myths in public debate is that security agencies see everything. They do not. They operate under legal constraints, practical limits, and human limits. They can miss signals. They can misjudge people. They can be overwhelmed by case volume. They can face ambiguity that only becomes clear after the fact. And in some cases, individuals move faster than the system can react. That is one reason terrorist incidents often trigger reviews. Not just of the attacker, but of the process. What was known? When was it known? Who held the information? Was it shared? Was the person downgraded? Was the risk model wrong? Were resources stretched? Those questions matter because modern counter-terrorism is as much about process quality as raw intelligence. The UK does not need to identify every extremist thought. It needs to identify the right people at the right time with enough confidence to act lawfully and effectively. That is an extraordinarily difficult task. And the larger the pool of concern becomes, the harder it gets. There is also a civil liberties dimension here. A democratic country must constantly balance security and freedom. How much monitoring is justified? How early should intervention happen? What counts as extremist concern versus lawful but offensive opinion? How much data should be retained? Who gets referred? Who gets stigmatized unfairly? These are not side issues, they are central issues. Because a system built to track thousands of people can protect society, but it can also generate distrust if it becomes too opaque, too broad, or too careless. So the UK's challenge is not only operational, it is constitutional and social too. Can you build a system strong enough to detect genuine danger, but restrained enough to remain legitimate? That is the real balancing act. And it is why counter-extremism in the UK is never just about catching bad people. It is about deciding how a democratic state identifies, prioritizes, and manages risk without becoming something else in the process. So let's bring this all together. How does the UK track thousands of potential extremists at once? Not by putting all of them under constant direct surveillance, not by relying on one agency, and not by using one giant master switch. It does it through layers. Layers of intelligence, layers of policing, layers of reporting, layers of assessment, layers of prioritization, layers of intervention, and above all, constant reassessment. People enter the system through different routes. Their risk is judged through combinations of behavior, intent, capability, association, and trajectory. A small number become high-priority cases. A much larger number remain somewhere on the wider radar. Most are not watched intensively, but they may be visible enough that new warning signs can trigger renewed attention. That is how a country manages scale, not by watching everyone equally, but by building a machine that can sort danger continuously. And that machine is never finished. It has to adapt to online radicalization, lone actors, mixed ideologies, prison risk, political pressure, legal limits, and public scrutiny all at once. Which means the real story is not that the UK has a perfect system. It does not. The real story is that it is trying to solve an almost impossible problem. How do you identify the few people who may become violent from the many people who may never act without losing control of resources, legality, or public trust? That is the challenge. And that is why tracking extremists at scale is less like watching a list and more like managing a constantly shifting map of human risk. And in modern Britain, that map never stays still for long. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, because on this channel, we break down how British systems really work. From intelligence and policing to infrastructure, governance, and national security. And if you want to understand the machinery behind the headlines, you are in the right place.